Okay, this is going to be a combination of subjects we've covered in varying degrees in the past, but there are several important differences because some of what we're going to discuss has to do with changing market conditions. So here's what we're going to talk about: inspection contingency, which we've obviously talked about before, but we're going to talk about changing strategy and how you should be advising clients and how that may need to change because the market has changed recently. Proper service of notices, that's a continuing issue that we see all the time, that we'll discuss the consequences of messing it up. So we always like to have some real estate prison stories and soap dropping episodes. So we'll get into some of that, specific examples, and then we're going to have a conversation about Michelle's eyes are about this big. We're also going to get into a discussion of paragraph 5D versus 5A2 because those can overlap to some extent, and they become very, very important from a strategic standpoint. I want to say at the outset, and you'll see it in a few different slides as we go through today, bring attorneys into involvement with your clients early in the transaction. Nothing we discuss here is specific legal advice. Number one, I'm not licensed to give it. Number two, if I were, I'm not your lawyer. So it's not specific legal advice, but we need to understand the ins and outs of this contract well enough that we're able to think a couple steps ahead of the client and we know when to get them in front of their attorney. So you'll see where there are specific attorney intervention moments, you'll see those highlighted in the slides. We'll also quickly discuss the financing contingency. This is a subject Madeline wanted brought up, but I'm probably going to be discussing not exactly the issue that is her hot button because there isn't really a good solution to it. But there are some important things to know, and it's one of the most frequently misunderstood parts of our contract, and it is not something that's going to change. No one is amused by the 7-day kabuki dance. Nobody thinks that's kind of cute. All right.
It's very cool.
Thank you.
Kabuki.
All right, so inspection contingency. So buyer agents need to be on record making clear that serving any sort of post-inspection notice puts you at risk of destroying the entire contract. So we don't want to overplay that. You don't want to make your buyer think that if you ask for reasonable stuff that you're going to end up with no house. But you want to be on record at some point having said that it's possible, because it's always possible. You'll see the only way it's not possible is if you limit your requests, not just limit them to 5A2 items, but you limit the request to 5A2 items and only invoke paragraph 5A2. So let me clarify. So 5A2, plumbing, heating, electrical, basically major mechanical. So let's say that everything that came up on your particular home inspection was electrical and plumbing. There was an active leak in a drain underneath the bathroom sink, and you had several outlets with reversed polarity. That's objectively wrong as opposed to a 50-year-old house that has open ground. So I'm using that as a specific, deliberate example. If you want to not subject that contract to jeopardy, you need to not merely serve a notice and only ask for 5A2 items. You need to serve the notice as a notice of seller warranted defects under paragraph 5A2. You need to specifically not invoke paragraph 5D, because if you invoke paragraph 5D, you then go back to the journey to self-destruction. So we'll discuss that a little more as we go through. Here we're going to start getting into the changing strategy. If you serve a post-inspection notice and the seller happens to be looking for a way out of that contract, there is absolutely no way you can hold them to it. Tim Drollinger was just telling me a story of that this week. Listing side, buyer serves a notice. Seller would be willing to correct every defect because there was a septic issue, and I think well-needed shocking. They were very curable issues, but because it was a 5D notice and what the buyer requested was to enter into an agreement, what I'm requesting is full replacement of the septic and well. In other words, there's no possible way the sellers would say yes to that. All the buyers have to do to ensure that they can bail out of the contract is just ask for something insanely unreasonable that guarantees there will be no agreement to that request, and there is no possible way the listing agent or the sellers, no matter how willing they are to correct every actual defect, there's no way they can keep them in the deal. You're just absolutely powerless to prevent it. So if you serve a post-inspection notice and the seller happens to be looking for a way out, and I'll give you some examples. They think, I think I may have put the examples here. Okay, here we go. I'll get to it in a second because I know I wrote it in here. So buyer agents need to be on record making clear that if you serve any sort of post-inspection notice, you jeopardize the entire contract. So notice under paragraph 5D starts you on a path towards self-destruction. That's a good way to say it, because once you serve that notice by the first deadline in paragraph 5D, that's exactly what you're doing. You are on a path that will automatically end in self-destruction of your contract. You only avert contract self-destruction if the parties come to an agreement subsequent to that first notice. So that is not an inaccurate way to characterize it to the buyers. Again, we don't want to overstate the risk that they will end up with no house and no contract, but that is what the contract language says, is you're heading down a path that will automatically terminate the contract unless the parties come to an agreement. So make sure buyers and agents are carefully considering whether it's worth risking the contract before, and here's a couple of my favorite examples, before a buyer of a house that's not new decides they want to serve a request asking that a fogged window that they could see every one of the 16 times they asked to see the house before they wrote the offer. They asked that that be replaced. That's going to cost $150 on a house that they knew was not brand new to begin with, or because, God forbid, they accept a house that has a cracked neoprene boot that may require $100 to fix on a house that they knew was not brand new. So if you're asking for items like that, but most of what's in the contract is really not a big deal, you want to make sure that the buyer knows it may be a small risk you end up with no house, but is it worth bringing up a $100 item and incurring any risk that you will not have a contract to buy that house at the end of this process? One of the ways that you want to think about the risk mitigation is part of our jobs, since we've been through the process start to finish so many more times than our clients. One of the things that we need to always do is be mentally 2 or 3 or 4 or 10 steps ahead of the client. You always want to be thinking through what is the very, very worst that could happen. The buyer thinks they're making a reasonable request. The seller happens to be itching to bail out of that contract. Buyer makes reasonable request, ends up with no house, and then says, "You never told me that this could happen." That's one of the most important moments that we need to avoid, not just with respect to this, but in all of the things that we do. You want to not necessarily rarely do you want to push the client down a particular path. You just want to make sure that they understand all the possible directions the transaction could take, and you are on record having explained it to them so that there's no way, no matter how it turns out, that they could say, "You never told me that this was even a remote possibility." So, remind buyers that they agreed. So this is all on the theme of setting expectations. Remind them the contract that they signed says they are accepting the premises and as is condition. I think our buyers need to be reminded of that frequently and vigorously. Remind them that if they're not purchasing a brand new house, that they are not entitled to perfection. I've lost count of the number of times I've been on the listing side of transactions of houses that are not new, where a buyer tenders a post-inspection request, usually doesn't tender it properly, but tenders a post-inspection request and asks for every single item that appeared in the repairs needed summary. Which then, of course, begs the question, what part of not a new house did you not understand? So, I think it's very important for buyer's agents to calibrate expectations in this regard when it is not a brand new house. It makes it a lot more likely the buyer will be reasonable when they get to the end of the inspection process and don't think that they're entitled to everything being done. And it's really handy if you can point to language in the contract that they have fixed their signature to, which is, and not only does it say they're taking it as is, the very beginning of paragraph 5 says the buyers have inspected the premises. It means they've looked at it with their own eyes. They're generally familiar with how the property looks. And so I then go on to tell them, when we're talking inspection issues, you can ask for anything you want. The inspection contingency is very broad, so it puts no limits on what you can ask for. You can be as crazy and reasonable as you feel like being. However, you need to put yourself in the shoes of the seller. So unless this is a house that you don't want to get, put yourself in the shoes of a seller and ask yourself, is what you're asking for actually newsworthy? Like, was it hidden and took an inspector to ferret it out because it needed somebody with expertise? And is it generally inconsistent with your expectations for a property in this sort of condition, the condition that you observed it to be in? Those are two really important threshold questions that I would suggest that you find a way to get in front of your buyers. Did it take an expert to find, and is it generally inconsistent with our overall expectations for the property? So remind them they're not buying a new house if they're not. and just in general be thinking realistic expectations. So what's changed in the market recently? What feels different this year versus last?
Buyers.
Yeah, like there are some, for a change.
Calls.
And yeah, phone rings. Thing on my desk, it turns out, is not a paperweight, it's not ornamental. So it's no longer a complete buyer's market. Multiple offers are not uncommon. And it's actually within our team happened a few different times. Jeffrey and I ended up with competing buyers on the same property not very long ago. And the people that I was representing also had multiple offers on the house they were selling. So it started to come up actually not uncommonly at all very, very recently. So that does mean that you want to go back to reminding your buyers that they never ever can know for certain what's going through the seller's mind in terms of, has that seller either thought the minute the ink dried on the contract with your people, did the seller think, whether rationally or not, that there's some other buyer out there that would have paid $5,000 more? And some sellers absolutely will think that and be convinced of it even if it's not true. Doesn't matter if it's true or not. What matters is if they think they should be bailing out of the contract they've already signed. That's one example of how you never know when you serve a request for the torn neoprene boot that might be exactly what the seller was waiting for. Nope, you're getting no agreement. You are out of this deal because I think I can sell it to somebody else. Or they just got cold feet. Or, as happened to me this past week, buyers get under contract to buy full price within 48 hours of it hitting the MLS. Pretty much match the seller's terms in every possible way. In the negotiate, the only thing that was not exactly as listed was the buyers wanted to take possession in 45 instead of 60 days. Sellers countered with they needed the 60. We gave them the 60. Then after the sellers signed the contract, sellers needed another 2 days for an item they had on their calendar for months. So we changed the contract after it was fully executed because we're nice people, because as Mark Miller once said, we're in the happy business. Then again, the sellers wanted to change it because of a personal issue that had come up. Now we think, as we approach the home inspection, we don't know if these people are going to bail out of the contract because the possession issue on a contract that's already fully executed has become such a hot button for them that if they have any opening to terminate the contract, that they'll take it. So that's a specific instance that came up this week that prompted a discussion with my buyer clients about, therefore be very, very cautious before serving a post-inspection notice, no matter how reasonable the requests are, taken just objectively in terms of stuff that you would expect a seller to fix. Be very cautious about making any requests because the seller, we already have reason to think, may be looking to pull the trigger and bail out of the deal. This is going to be the most important and memorable moment of Legal Thursday, which is a group reading of the notices paragraph. I know it's always perilous for us to do stuff like, look at what the contract says that governs our real estate transactions. It's like what Tom Roth says about Catholics in the Bible. They don't have to read it. They just rely on what their clergy tell them about what's in it. So I think realtors are guilty of the same thing often, and they feel real guilty all the time. That's the other thing. But realtors are guilty of the same thing. We have to live by this contract. It's what governs every aspect of these transactions, and I cannot believe how many realtors don't ever read what it says. So we're going to have a quick reading. Nope. Right. Thank you, Max. Any notice required under the contract to be served upon sellers or buyers shall be in writing and shall be deemed effective when either actually received or when mailed to such party as evidenced by certified mail or upon postal certification of mailing to such party. Information copies of all such notices shall be sent or delivered to offices of the attorneys and realtors named herein, and such information copies may be sent by facsimile transmission. Paragraph 15 continued. Notice to or from one of the multiple buyers shall be effective as to all buyers. Notice to or from one of multiple sellers shall be effective as to all sellers. In the event seller's address is not shown herein, notices as provided in this paragraph may be sent to the sellers at the common address of the real estate. In the event that any certified mailing is indicated, return receipt requested, such mailing shall also be made by first-class mail. Quiz, do you have to send it by first-class mail? I'm sorry, by certified mail.
You just said you did.
Pardon me?
Didn't it just say you did?
No, it did not. Wrong.
Wrong.
No. But if you don't, so that remember, notices shall be deemed effective either when actually received or as evidenced by the certified mail receipt. So you don't have to, but if you don't, you then are going to be potentially stuck in the position of having to prove that it was actually received. So what you need to imagine when you're thinking about this and whether certified mail is really worth it, if you're coming close to a post-inspection deadline, that's the most common one. It's not the only deadline, but it's the most common one where it becomes very, very important. If you are riding close to that deadline and you are sending it some manner other than certified mail with a receipt in your hand dated on or before the first deadline in paragraph 5D, ask yourself the question, are you open to a recipient of that notice saying, notice? What notice? I didn't get it. Prove that I did.
I have to cover myself.
So imagine that you are being drawn into a trial when the transaction all melts down and the parties are suing each other's pants off, and you're on the stand trying to prove that they got the notice. There are pretty strong types of circumstantial evidence that you could have, like they sent it and sent a response. That's strong circumstantial evidence. If a response to your post-inspection request was received prior to the first deadline in paragraph 5D, that's very strong evidence that they did see your notice, otherwise they wouldn't be responding to it. Or if you're 4 or 5 days ahead of the deadline, or a week ahead of the deadline, because you had a last-minute cancellation, the inspector got you in a week earlier than you thought, if you get a fully executed post-inspection agreement and that all happens before you even get to the first deadline, I don't care if you sent it via certified mail because it's a moot point at that point. So you do need to be able to prove actually received, and just think of it the way I told you, that you're on the witness stand having to try to prove that they got it. So certified mail, end of discussion. You don't have to prove they got it. In fact, they cannot have gotten it and you're still fine. You still, as long as you have that mail receipt, you are absolutely in the clear being able to say, nope, doesn't matter if they got it or not, I followed the letter of the contract and this ends the discussion. Any questions on that? Make sense? You don't need to be the gopher. Not nearly enough of us are in the habit of sending certified mail. I don't necessarily need all of you to worry about running to the post office before it closes at 6 p.m. Don't be afraid to tell your client they need to do it. Balance that against the client thinking that you're a lazy slug and that why don't you go do it yourself. But what's way more important is that it gets done that way if you're running close to a deadline, because you don't want to be put in the position of the other party saying, notice what notice, and you have no way to prove that it was either received or that you properly served it. So don't be afraid to tell the client, you got to get this to the post office and here's exactly how you need to do it.
And so when you go to the post office and you send that and they ask if you want...
I'm going to say, look at this. Right. Excellent segue. So, quiz number 2, are you supposed to send with return receipt requested?
Yes.
Yes.
No.
Either way. With or without. It's just that if you do, if you request a return receipt, see all the exciting things that are just hidden in paragraph 15, the mysteries that were waiting to be unlocked today? Under the letter of the contract, you may do it either way. It's just that if you do choose to ask for a return receipt, then we go to the last sentence of the paragraph. Such mailing shall also be made by first-class mail. And the reason that it requires that is, if you request a return receipt, it is entirely possible that either because a recipient willfully refuses to sign for it, or simply nobody is at home. If a return receipt is requested, the item will physically never get delivered to the addressee. Whereas, if you have no return receipt requested, you can have a certified mailing and not request a return receipt, and it will get delivered even if there's no person there into whose hands it is placed. So if you're going to have the return receipt, the first class duplicate mailing is required to ensure that somebody's going to get a copy left even if a person's not there signing for it. Any questions? Ask attorneys. Some of them have strong preferences. No question the contract will let you do it either way. With or without return receipt is acceptable under the contract. But I've encountered attorneys who have said very emphatically, I would never not ask for a return receipt. And so some attorneys strongly would prefer return receipt requested and duplicate copy sent via first class mail. Any questions on that? So the when actually received part, your default setting, as I said, needs to always be certified mail. Like I said, contract doesn't technically require certified mail, but that needs to be the standpoint that we approach it from. So as I said, if you're running comfortably ahead of your first paragraph 5D deadline, and you either have a fully executed agreement or you get a substantive response, like a counter proposal to your request. That's pretty strong evidence of actually received. Use your own good judgment, but when in doubt, certified mail is the way to go. So this we already discussed. But the bottom line is with certified mail, as the second bullet says, no further proof is needed. That's the end of the story. All right, so paragraph 5A2 versus 5D. We're going to have another reading of the contract. So in paragraph 5A, buyer's inspection. Buyers acknowledge they've inspected the real estate and the improvements thereon. They're acquainted with the condition thereof and are not relying on any verbal representations of the sellers or their agents. Subject to normal wear and tear, buyers accept the premises as of the time they executed this contract in, and then normally it's 5A2, as is condition except sellers warrant the plumbing, heating, electrical, and air conditioning systems, septic, sewer, and water systems, and built-in appliances to be in normal working condition on the date of possession except as follows. So a few important things here. I tell buyers when we're going over the contract, you acknowledge you've inspected the real estate, not a home inspector, not a professional inspection. It means you've seen it with your own eyes. That is basically a, you're not doing this sight unseen provision, is the way for us to think about it. Doesn't necessarily mean you couldn't have somebody who's never physically been there, but they're affirming in that contract that they are familiar with the condition of the property. Okay, so you've seen, we just read what this actually says. So one of the most important distinctions is that 5A2 does not create any possibility of ending up with no contract. That's the biggest risk of paragraph 5D when you're talking to your buyers is, Mr. and Mrs. Buyer, if you send this notice, there is a chance you will have no contract and no house in a few days when we get to deadline number 2. You can though, so 5A2, no possibility of the contract terminating, but you can end up in an argument over what does or does not constitute a departure from normal working condition. Favorite examples? Oh, come on. Ungrounded outlets, for example. You get people, so it's a 50-year-old house. House was built in 1950, nothing in the listing indicated that it had been 100% rewired, and the buyer suddenly wants to demand that 50 ungrounded outlets that happen to have 3-prong receptacles be retrofitted with proper grounding. Does that on a 50-year-old house constitute a legitimate departure from normal working condition? I would suggest it does not. So you can make the argument, but this is an example of how no chance that you end up with no contract here, but there's still every chance you end up in an argument. Another example would be you got a 25-year-old furnace that was installed with no longer code permitted flexible gas line, and it has no drip leg. The furnace was installed okay at the time, there's no drip leg, it works, it heats the house. Are you entitled under 5A2 to hit the seller up for a retrofit of a drip leg at the furnace installation? Probably not. So just be aware, you have to be reasonable. It's normal working, it's not like new, and it's not perfect. Any questions on that? It's really important that you have this conversation with buyers in the spirit of setting realistic expectations. And the earlier you have the conversation before we ever show up at the home inspection or when they first show up at the home inspection, the earlier you have the conversation, the more likely they are not to walk into it with an entitlement mentality. At a minimum, we get buyers that walk in thinking, well, I'm at least gonna squeeze the $350 worth of inspection fees out of the seller's hide one way or the other. So 5A2 versus 5D, consider whether the priority is not to jeopardize the whole contract and whether without jeopardizing the contract you can still accomplish your objectives. This is a spot where you definitely want your clients to have their attorney's input. We want you to understand the distinction between the nuances of 5A2 and 5D. You do not want to be the party responsible for giving nuanced legal interpretations of these provisions of the contract. Know the mechanics of how it works, know what the ramifications are. Don't be the one giving nuanced legal advice, but know when you want to drag them in front of their attorney and say, here's the strategy we're thinking of, we want to get your blessing on it. Any questions on that? Another reading. That's it for inspection and 5A2 stuff. So let me pause and see if there's anything else or any horror stories you have before we talk financing follies.
So under the new contract that's coming out soon,
Yeah.
if we ever do get to use that, see, is it an address rate on? I know that's always
yes.
Interesting.
Okay, so the problem we have right now, The existing contract, Richard Joy likes because it's drafted to be broad and therefore you can interpret it as including any sort of inspection. But we know that in our world, our seller who is signing this document, nowhere on the document does it say radon. Nowhere does it say radon, lead, mold, any of these other types, asbestos. Nowhere does it say anything about those other things, and therefore when they have the radon guy showing up with test equipment, I never consented to this. Well, you executed a contract that included within it an inspection contingency, and as long as they're operating within their deadlines, it never said they were testing for radon. So the new contract will indicate that inspections permissible under the terms of the inspection contingency may include but are not limited to, and it runs down a laundry list of all those sorts of things. Because the point that the Realtor members of that working group made is, we don't doubt that the existing wording would still be potentially legally workable. It's just, we know the reality is that the sellers have never seen that it could include radon. They're going to feel like they were blindsided when somebody tests for radon.
One of the things that we do when we're representing buyers, if they want to have radon, we try real hard when we submit the contract to have a radon authorization form with that at the same time.
That's a good idea.
So then we're not writing on the face of the contract.
Yeah, that's a very good idea. Max?
Just had one where it came in as a repair amendment. That it was, and it stated on the repair amendment specifically that it was going to have a radon inspection, and then also spelled out that if there was radon, that the seller agreed to mitigate.
Probably, I mean, because it's conditional, because it's conditioned on the testing, that's probably arguably a misuse of the repair amendment. It's not, I mean, it's probably better than scrawling it in the margin at the bottom of page 1 of the contract, but it's still arguably a misuse of the repair amendment. I don't know. I mean, it helps that it's a state licensed profession. So, you know, it says workmanlike manner. That's the boilerplate language in the repair amendment. So it's not that that won't work. It's probably just technically a little bit of a misuse. Square peg, round hole. Marianne?
Do we have a radon authorization form?
It's going to be a proprietary form specific to the firm doing it, right, Bill? You don't have, there's not a universal one. It's whichever inspection firm you expect to use.
If we're using Troy, we use his from his website, or Christine theirs.
That's a really good strategy, though, because as Bill said, it keeps you from handwriting in the margins of the contract, which is important. Fred?
Going back to 5A2, have you ever had a seller refuse to take something that is obviously a 5A2 item?
Sure.
And?
You end up playing a game of chicken. So if you have served a 5A2 notice for items that a reasonable person would say are solidly within paragraph 5A2, and the seller just says no, or says no and I dare you to sue me over it, if it's a $150 item, are you going to sue them over it? No. If it's a huge item like a cracked heat exchanger, you know, you end up with one of the conversations I'll have with buyers when we talk about setting realistic expectations. When we talk about their leverage. On the one hand, you want to make sure the buyers know if you send this notice under 5D, you have started down a path that will destroy the contract unless all the parties come to a written agreement that stops it from self-destruction. But your leverage, Mr. and Mrs. Buyer, is much, much greater if the items are serious material defects, and especially if they are defects that are directly within the scope of what is required in the Illinois Residential Real Property Disclosure Report. So, for example, we explain, you know, to the buyer client that if the furnace had a serious defect, cracked heat exchanger obviously is sort of the bullseye, but if it's a serious defect, like a backdrafting water heater, there's a good example, where you need to modify something about the installation, but the water heater itself isn't you know, exploding or anything. That would be an example of where if they don't do it, and they've got buyers already ready to buy, is that sort of serious life safety issue when you can tell that it's backdrafting combustion exhaust fumes into the house? Is that the sort of thing they're going to have a legal obligation to disclose to every future buyer? Yes, I am aware of defects with the water heater backdrafting into the house. Well, that you have much more leverage there. particularly if you lean a little bit on the listing agent, make sure they know that even if your seller is going to pretend that he does not now know, have actual notice of basement leakage or foundation bulging or backdrafting exhaust gases from their furnace or their hot water heater, even if your seller wants to pretend they don't know that, you now know it and you're going to have a separate obligation to disclose it. So if it's within the scope of items that seem like a slam dunk to have to disclose, that gives you an awful lot more leverage. But still, if they say no, you can sue them. They're in default. You're in default. All right, do something about it. Jean?
I have noticed the Coldwell Banker is using a mold disclosure
Yep.
on everything.
Uh-huh.
Should we be doing that?
Not that I know of.
Okay.
It's not mandated under any statute at this point. You know, as Paul Espinoza, our Pearl Insurance guy, who comes in every year to talk to us, as Paul has said, you know, it's always good. People don't get in trouble in our business for over-disclosing. People get into trouble for under-disclosing. So I see no harm in doing it. The problem, I guess, is that if it's going to be like the lead disclosure, in my opinion, where the lead disclosure is disclosing how much you know, actual knowledge, not whether it exists, how much you know about something that's been out of production for 34 or 35 years. And so now all of the disclosures always say, I don't have any records, I have no knowledge, I don't know anything about anything. And I've never yet seen a mold disclosure that says, oh yes, let me tell you about the growth. So, and if they know about it, it probably came up in a pre-listing home inspection, in which case you're probably just as well off to have the inspection report in front of your eyeballs that notes because the home inspectors are pretty quick to point out they're not mold experts, so it usually characterizes being possible or suspected mold. But I don't see any harm with it as a practice. And remember, the local Coldwell Banker office is owned by a group that's based out of Chicagoland, suburban Chicago. So it's entirely possible they did that as an across-the-board company policy that started maybe in one of their...
I think it probably is.
That's just a guess. So I see no problem with it, though. Any other questions? All right. All right, so I'm going to run through this. Paragraph 20, diligent effort and notice. This contract may be immediately terminated by notice of termination served by sellers upon buyers if buyers have not formally applied for the above financing on or before blank. If buyers, after diligent effort, are unable to obtain such a commitment on or before blank and serve written notice of termination upon sellers stating such inability, then buyers shall be entitled to a refund of the earnest money and this contract shall be void. If 7 days prior to the commitment deadline, no such notice has been served by buyers upon sellers, the sellers may take no action, in which case this financing contingency shall continue. Alternatively, sellers may at any time thereafter serve upon buyers notice that buyers have 7 days thereafter to serve notice of termination. If no such notice of termination is served by buyers upon sellers within that additional 7-day period, then this contract shall remain in full force and effect, and the financing contingency shall be deemed to have been waived by buyers. Our buyers all understand this when they sign the contracts, right? Oh, totally.
Very
totally. So a couple of important points from that mess. Always put a real date in the first blank. Do not put pre-approved. As I explained in the slide, lenders will not necessarily consider the application to have been completed. And remember, that first deadline is the deadline by which they will have formally made application. Lender may not consider the application complete until they're in receipt of the executed contract. So a very, very safe way to make sure that you are never going to end up with a technically incomplete application where a seller then looks to pull the trigger and unilaterally terminate the contract for the reasons we discussed earlier. As soon as the ink dried, they thought they could have sold it to somebody else for $5,000 more. Put a date that is at least 2 or 3 or 4 business days ahead of, not today, ahead of the date you realistically expect to have a fully executed contract. That is the safest way to make sure, because this is the only provision I'm aware of in the contract where it just gives the seller unilateral power to bang, contract over. So be aware of that. Again, something that becomes more important as the market conditions shift and you may have more sellers who are feeling a little bit more powerful. Commitment deadline means absolutely nothing. That's the most important thing our buyers need to understand. As printed, the date that goes into deadline number 2 in that paragraph does not mean anything. Because, as bullet 2 says, if seller does not serve upon buyers notice that buyers have 7 days thereafter to serve a notice of termination, the financing contingency shall continue. And so we have the 7-day kabuki dance. In other words, without action on the seller's part to start this process, the commitment deadline means nothing and buyers can still bail if they can't get their financing. Still bail and get their earnest money back. So it just means that you have this indefinite rolling 7-day period, but the earliest, let me put this differently. If you wanted to put teeth into the financing commitment deadline, and that's a big if. We'll discuss that next. If you want to put teeth in the deadline so it means exactly what it says, the only way to do that is to serve the 7-day notice 7 days in advance of the deadline, the commitment deadline, letting the buyers know formally that they have 7 days from the date of the notice, either to terminate or waive their financing contingency. Unless you do that 7 days in advance of the deadline doesn't mean what it says. If you do it on the date of the deadline rolls back by a week, and it will always be a week ahead of your 7-day notice. Any questions on that? So should you serve a 7-day notice? We have some attorneys in town. This is an interesting example of where the attorneys do not all operate the same. We have some attorneys in town who always serve 7-day notices. I personally think that is a bad policy because I think at a minimum it needs to be done on a case-by-case basis. So, should you always serve it? Probably not. Almost certainly not always. Always make sure your client gets legal advice. Again, that contract provision, the paragraph that we're talking about, most realtors would grossly fail any quiz on the contents of that because it's a miserably confusing provision. We don't want to be giving clients nuanced legal advice on that. We want to know the mechanics of it, we want to know how it can play out, but we want to make sure it's their attorney who's telling them. And that's why I prefer a case-by-case analysis as opposed to an attorney who just fires off the 7-day notice like clockwork 7 days in advance of that deadline, and here's why. If you don't serve the notice, the deadline means nothing. If you do serve it, you could psych a perfectly good buyer right out of the contract. Yep. What does that look like? Here's a quick fact pattern for you. Buyer has not yet received their financing commitment, but the buyer is not expecting any problems. There's nothing wrong with their application. It's just not fully approved yet. The seller serves a 7-day notice because they're 7 days in advance of the deadline. The buyer then gets this notice, which is a terrifying thing to have arrive via certified mail from a lawyer's office if it was properly served. So the buyer then gets this. The buyer is then forced either, 2 choices. I'm going to either terminate the contract, citing an inability to get financing because I don't have it yet, not expecting a problem, but I don't have it today, and I've now been told I have 7 days from the date of this notice, which was mailed 2 days ago, or I need to waive my financing contingency. Well, I don't expect problems, but if I waive my financing contingency and I get hit by a bus and can't work, or I lose my job, or any of those other very unlikely but very bad scenarios right up until closing, then I am liable. Not only can't I get my financing, but they can now sue my pants off. That's a serious problem. And so the buyer, who would have been perfectly fine, is on a delightful glide path into a successful closing with no problems in sight. A perfectly good buyer is psyched right out of the contract. Well, I'm not going to waive my financing contingency and I don't have the approval in my hands, and so I guess I need to terminate. Everyone see how that can play out? A perfectly good transaction gets derailed because you psych somebody out because of the 7-day kabuki dance. Fred?
Even with the presentation of the 7-day notice, the buyer receives it, but the buyer and the seller mutually agreed to a new date.
Sure, absolutely.
That's what I typically do.
Absolutely. But as currently written, so let's say that you're extending, that the new date is 1 week away. I mean, that you want to give it a week's extension. Because in most cases, just to use a few general assumptions, in most cases we're going to assume that conventional financing, we're going to have a commitment deadline that's about a month out. If it's VA, FHA, USDA rural development, we might put it 5 or 6 weeks out. But if it's conventional, I think we'd mostly agree a month is a pretty realistic, reasonable time frame that we would put. So you get close to that deadline. We don't have it. There's no sign of trouble. You approach the other agent in a perfectly reasonable fashion. How long are they going to want to extend it? Another 3 weeks? No. By 1 week? Probably. If it's extended by 1 week, then what happens? You serve the 7-day notice as soon as they sign the initial to the change for the deadline, which is going to still put you right back into the same everyone's on pins and needles. And then the other really bad part of this is that your sellers assume, well, if that buyer bails out, I'm at least getting their earnest money. No. Well, if that buyer bails out after the deadline for the financing commitment, I at least get their earnest money. No. No, because their financing contingency continued indefinitely because no 7-day notice was served. Why was no 7-day notice served? Because it has all these other drawbacks. You need to have your attorney, the client's attorney, guiding them through that thicket. But you can now see exactly how that can break bad. And several of us probably have seen it go bad. But that's again why you want to make sure it's the attorney that's been involved in advising them on the legal nuances of that. Any questions on that part of it? Fred's point was a very good one. It's just you can end up right back at the starting line where, yep, here's your new deadline, here's your new notice.
So going back to what in the beginning we were talking about helping manage expectations. Once your client declares who their attorney is, it makes sense to just call that attorney and say, we have a mutual client. What's your philosophy on the 7-day notice?
Tell me what your opinion of kabuki theater is.
Yeah.
That's a pretty good idea. Because the other thing is that the ones that send the notices out like clockwork, since we're the ones that have seen them break bad when there wasn't an actual problem, it was really nothing other than an attorney who didn't look at it on a case-by-case basis, happened to psych the other party right out of the contract. You may want to have that conversation and not just find out what their philosophy is. Give them an opinion. You know, even the attorneys that have strong opinions that we don't agree with, it's very rare that it's because they're morons. It's usually an honest difference in perspective. So they have an opinion that's perfectly valid from a legal mechanics standpoint. We just know that on the ground, that can have the practical effect of psyching people out of perfectly good contracts and perfectly good transactions. So another reason to sort of get some read on what that attorney's philosophy is, and if it is that we're going to send it out like clockwork, at least have the conversation as to why you think that may not be appropriate all the time, and see if they'll at least look at the case-by-case analysis and not just mark the calendar and fire it on out.
So I've been in transactions where Pat Fitzgerald has been on the selling side, and I have come to my own conclusion that he's one that's automated with that. Mm-hmm. Anyone else that you've run across that seems... That's the only
name that comes to mind. And again, it doesn't mean that a totally competent attorney and actually does a fair bit of real estate, so not a problem there. Just be aware of that. And you asked about the setting of expectations. When I go through this contract with buyers, I make sure that they know, because one of the blanks, that's what the buyers are looking at. The buyers are going blank by blank by blank to see what it says. Well, financing commitment by on or before. And I do make sure, because sometimes if you put a date that seems like it's a little on the tight side, or they're concerned because they don't know what a reasonable date is or not, I will let them know that does not mean what it says. It only means what it says if, and only if, the sellers preemptively serve upon you this 7-day notice. And even then, it doesn't just mean that you have to have your commitment or you're in default. It still means at that point you can terminate, which is a strong reason why the sellers don't generally want to serve that notice on you. So at least have a brief conversation with them. Let them know that that deadline doesn't mean what it says except if. Just make sure they understand there are fairly complex terms in that paragraph that go with that deadline that can mean that it doesn't mean what it says. Any other questions? All right, most exciting revelation. I'm just kind of curious, getting your opinions on what you looked at differently today than what you had in the past. Don't all jump in at once.
Just, I think for me, just to reiterate or to try to help them understand that when you do send the post-inspection request, if it's not all 5A2 items that are reasonable expectation that we couldn't have observed in walking through. That will be my talking points as we're walking through or when we start to do.
And one clarification on that. So I discussed when you may want to do 5A2 versus 5D. What I didn't say, but what of course is required there is certain types of defects that can be terribly, terribly serious aren't 5A2 defects, and so if you want to make an issue of it, you have no choice but to do 5D. Because so just a quick summary of the most significant defects that are not 5A2. Foundation buckling. I mean, the house could literally be about to collapse on itself, and that's not a 5A2 item. You have no choice but to address that via 5D. But that is also a very good example of an item where if they don't fix it, you don't want it. It's not that you're going to be terrified if the seller pulls the plug. It's going to be your side that wants to pull the plug if they're not going to fix it to your satisfaction. Window defects are not covered. Roof defects are not covered. Chimney and fireplace issues are not covered. So it really is just the mechanical systems of the house. And that provision wasn't intended to give you an either-or alternative with the inspection contingency. Of course, the rationale behind that 5A2 set of seller warranties is so that nobody at a final walkthrough has to get into a debate over whether the furnace worked at the home inspection or not. If it doesn't fire up at the walkthrough, it's still the seller's problem. Because otherwise, the contract says in the as-is period doesn't mean you're taking the house however you find it at the final walkthrough. You're taking the house as is as of the date of contract execution. Excellent job, Chuck. Date of contract execution. So that does not mean all bets are off. It just means you're taking it as is at this snapshot moment in time. The problem with that is if the furnace doesn't fire up at the final walkthrough, the sellers are going to want to debate with you whether or not it was that way when you signed the contract. That's where 5A2 eliminates the possibility of that debate. That's the real reason that exists, that set of warranties exists. It just so happens you can use it if you have an inspection where the serious items happen to all be with the mechanical systems and there's nothing terribly serious with the roof or the foundation or the windows or the fireplace, with those sorts of things. Then 5A2 can give you more of a safe harbor if your primary objective is not jeopardizing the integrity of the contract. Any other questions? Darnell?
On the post-inspection agreement, you have the two boxes down bottom.
Oh, yes.
Can you review those quickly for me?
Yes. I don't have it in front of me, but I'll get it in front of me. Why don't I do that? It beats making stuff up, I think.
Appreciate it.
I'm not above making stuff up, just to clarify. Okay, so here's the post-inspection agreement form. And what Darnell is talking about are the dreaded 5A2 continuation options.
Yeah.
All right, good question. And this is going to disappear in the next contract because it's so misunderstood. Yes,
Some
exactly.
of them may be retired before that.
Yeah.
Right, exactly. So I'm still going to discuss it because I've looked at actuarial tables and I know most of your ages, and many of us are going to have to practice under this for the remainder of our careers. So, continuation of paragraph 5A2 warranties. All right, so we're going to do another reading. The parties agree the above terms resolve all conditions noted in the inspection report. The warranties in paragraph 5A2 will not apply to conditions noted in the inspection report. Or, parties agree the warranties in paragraph 5A2 will apply to conditions noted in the report except those conditions for which a repair or a credit is specified above. Now let me explain the practical ramifications of the difference. Because at a quick reading, it's like I don't see that there is necessarily a difference. I don't understand what it is, and one sounds way scarier for the buyer than the other. I would politely assert to you that this is what really is in line with everyone's expectations. Option one. Because, if I may paraphrase, what that is saying is, because what's the whole purpose of this agreement? What do we seek to do with this whole form, the whole form?
Memorializing what they've agreed to.
It's putting to bed the inspection contingency. Yes, it's memorializing what's been agreed to, but it's with the purpose of putting to bed the inspection contingency. If you read the second option, if you don't have a repair specified, or a credit specified up here for an item that falls within the scope of paragraph 5A2, this option leaves open the possibility that the buyer had the home inspection, the buyer saw all of the observations made by the inspector and has an inspection report putting that into writing, and usually with pretty pictures. The buyer then chose to ask for some subset of those 5A2 items. Not all of them, some subset of them, because they're being reasonable. Because you, the buyer's agent, did a good job setting realistic expectations and they know they're not entitled to a brand new house. And yet, if you use that option, a buyer who saw all of those items in the contract, who only chose to ask for some of them, still has the ability right up until closing, at the closing table, to say, by the way, we've still got some other 5A2 items unresolved that are right here in the home inspection. Do you see how that would leave that open? That was clearly not the intention of the drafter, was to allow for an ambush, but that is a possible consequence. Now let me paraphrase the first option as I read it. Again, talk to your client's attorneys, this is not legal advice for you, but the first option says, it resolves all conditions noted in the inspection report. Is that not the purpose of the whole stupid document, to resolve all conditions noted in the inspection report? I would submit to you that it is. Yes?
The question I have is that if you check the first box there, and you know, we put to bed the inspection issues. What if the furnace goes out?
Did the inspection report say that the furnace was dead as a doornail at the time of inspection? Or is your question, what if the furnace tests in normal working condition at the inspection and doesn't fire up at the final walkthrough?
Exactly.
The condition noted was that the furnace worked. If the condition changes, then that is still totally 5A2.
Okay.
So the warranties only cease to apply to conditions noted in the inspection report. So if a furnace defect was noted and the buyer didn't ask for it and it didn't make it into the repairs or credits here, then under this option, it'd be off the table. But if it's a change in condition that would otherwise fall within the scope of paragraph 5A2, you're fine. So as I said, I'm not trying to throw the attorneys under the bus. They absolutely didn't intend this to be the, do you want your clients to be able to ambush the buyer, the buyers to be able to ambush the sellers at the closing table, or do you not? It's just that's one of the potential consequences of it.
Why did they put that in as an option?
I don't know. So suffice it to say, the one we're changing it to is this. But I will tell you, so how many of us have ever been on the other side of a transaction from a realtor who didn't understand every possible nuance of this? Anyone? Anyone? All right, so then, assuming each one of you walks out of the room and you feel like you have totally got a perfect grasp on the nuances of this, but you're dealing with somebody who is not as advanced as are you, and they absolutely cannot wrap their minds around it, and as far as they are concerned, that is the evil option, and you are only checking that because you are hell-bent on screwing their client over. I am a pragmatist. I'm a rules Nazi, but I'm a pragmatist. I will tell my client, go ahead and agree to the second stinking option that technically would leave you open to the ambush right up until the closing, because I've never seen a buyer actually do it. So I think that's the better option and is in line with both parties' realistic expectations and intentions. But if you have an agent on the other side who's insisting on this, and you either know because you've tried, or you know there's no point attempting to get them to change their mind on it because they don't understand it well enough to form an opinion, leave it there, because just make sure you tell the seller, here's the possible consequence, but as a practical matter, I've never seen that happen. I've never really seen a buyer come in and say, now let's talk about all the 5A2 items I deliberately chose not to ask for because I was saving them for an ambush at the closing table. And do you have another question, Darnell?
Yeah, I do. Actually, I've taken it a step further, and instead of just putting the items that relate to the inspection report, I actually do a separate Word document. I think you're pretty much aware of this.
Writing up what sorts of contract provisions?
Well, where I will lay out exactly how we want those items addressed.
Oh, okay.
Because I've actually seen before where overhang was in the inspection report was really, too heavy to be supported. So instead, what the seller did is they attached a 2x4.
Oh, classy.
To the end of the overhang.
That's all you need.
And then supported it to the house. So, I mean, it looked like it was ghetto engineered. Huh?
That would work.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, but it wasn't to the liking, of course, of
right. So,
the buyers.
All right. So Darnell makes a very good point. And again, You could probably guess what I'm going to say next. Bring your attorneys into this part of the process, because Darnell's point is a very good one. All this says is, shall repair in a reasonable and workmanlike manner. So the problem is if you just put, so the way this is, the boilerplate language here, as written, what this is really intended for is not to specify the repairs. It's really intended for you to simply list the defects. Because the repair is described up here. The gallery of defects that I'm going to list below are to be repaired in a reasonable and workmanlike manner. The problem is Darnell gave a really good example of how reasonable and workmanlike can be seen very differently by different parties. So if you know you have something that very, very specifically needs to be done a certain way, or it will totally not be satisfactory to your client, and the only way to make sure your client has an enforceable right to have it done exactly that way is to be specific, then you either have to get a separate document and write it in much, much more detail, but I would strongly encourage you to get the attorney involved at that point in the process, because it may require a slight tweak in this language, or it may simply be a parenthetical explanation of the reasonable and workmanlike fix shall be done as follows. So another good reason to bring in an attorney, but think when you're talking to your buyers, always think, because we've been through this, we know what divergent expectations look like when they blow up. Think about how what you're asking to be fixed could possibly be misunderstood, misinterpreted, and fixed exactly the way your buyers didn't want when you put it in there. And if you think it is subject to divergent expectations, find a way to make it clear exactly as Darnell said, so you don't end up with the ghetto engineering fix. Which was the name of my band in high school. Michelle?
I usually list the items, and then after the items, I'll put down those items are to be, fixed by a licensed professional, and receipts are required at closing. That way they know. Is that?
You can do that. However, there are a lot of cases where licensed professional isn't needed. So you'll get a lot of sellers who, so let's see, I got a repair request where they asked in their request, because they sent a notice on a separate letter, as a separate letter, which is technically what the contract envisions. The wording will be changed a little in the new one. This isn't really intended to be the notice. You can serve it as a proposed agreement and I guess make it the notice, but normally you see an attorney, if they're doing it, that's going to send a separate demand letter, basically, that serves as the notice. If that's the case, they may say in the demand letter, we want it done by a licensed contractor, and what you do is the parties agree to it. Jeffrey's thinking here. The parties agree to a certain set of items, and so you, the realtor, once they come to the final list, then go ahead and put it into one of these. So this will be the final agreement. No, nothing in here says licensed. It just says reasonable and workmanlike. So you may have taken the list of stuff that the original demand letter had in it, put it in here, and suddenly licensed is out the window. Be careful about demanding licensed, because if you have somebody who's going to get into the inside of an electric service panel, we definitely want them to be a licensed electrician. But you get into reverse polarity or an open ground or any number of other minor issues where a versatile handyman can get a dozen separate inspection items knocked out, versus a licensed electrician who shows up and charges $100 to smile and wave hello, and then the meter is running, at $75 an hour while they do the reverse polarity, which any of us can test with a $3 tester that I keep in my glove box at the final walkthrough. I mean, so I don't care if a monkey did it. If I have a $3 tester, I can tell if it works correctly, if the polarity was corrected. So it's another really good point to make. Just be careful what you ask for. And be careful if you're on the receiving side of having your client unknowingly agree to licensed contractors for a bunch of minor stuff, because that could be the difference between $700 of separate specialized licensed contractor minimum service charges versus a really competent handyman who is more than capable, who's going to charge $250 for all of the items. Good questions today, guys. All right, I don't want to keep you. Thanks for coming.